I'm Jessie Huff from Professor Brotherton's U.S. Government class, and this is my brother,
I'm Grayson Huff.
and this is my stepdad,
Sean Lee.
and this is our take on the documentary that we watched, 13th, which covers the history of racial inequality in the United States and nations' prisons being disproportionately filled with African Americans. So today I just have a few questions for my guests here. So first, what do you think are some of the positive changes that have been made after these issues have been brought into light by the documentary?
Well, towards the end of the documentary brought up social media and its influences on the status quo with how we treat these sorts of situations where the discussion of racism throughout the country's history is being brought to light. And one of the positive changes clearly has been the use of social media to spread out the word, as opposed to the media being on the opposite side in the past, where media on purpose stigmatizes people of color and African Americans at large to make them seem worse in our country and rightfully persecuted against, as opposed to what we see today, where social media is used throughout the world to expose these sorts of mistreatments. That's what I got for you.
Apparently your brother's making her laugh a little bit. So, you know what, that's a really good point, and I would agree with him. In today's society, I don't believe there's any rock you can hide under anymore. Everything is really exposed. We're a very connected society, and I think younger generations are learning of things that have happened in the past, but more importantly, what's happened currently. And all of that information is brought to the surface, and the information is being shared for the knowledge to be passed along for all of us. So I think the best part of that whole point he was making is that with social media now, everybody essentially being a journalist with their phones, with the internet, is that no story really goes untold. I still think we have a long way to go for a lot of those stories to be told, but it's exposed. It's on the surface now, and you have to hide if you don't want to talk about it.
Do you have any thoughts, Jesse?
Moving on. Do you think it's possible for us to have an ethically guided prison system with it still being privatized?
Well, one thing that I've thought about is that, specifically with the private prison system that we have in America today, is that either way, it's going to be funded by private corporations. But at least with the governmentally funded side, still, sure, yes, it's funded by super PACs that are given to politicians to keep these prisons up and running, but also it's regulated according to the law, whereas private prisons and private corporations running prisons, as they do today, especially in states such as this one, Texas, and other states where privatization is seen much more as a positive. Goodness, I froze. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. Do you think it's possible for us to have an ethically guided prison system with it still being privatized?
My realistic answer is no. But that's based on my experience, I guess, watching the system, lopsided as it is. I don't know. To me, big corporations and anything that's that big, when we talk about almost a euphoric idea of that somehow they're going to follow guidelines and appropriate ethics, I struggle with that. I have trouble believing that. It seems like a very dark system. I think the change starts in the courts, the change starts in the laws, and I think without those being changed first, prison reform is going to be difficult. I'm not sure why. Just it seems to me that it's ingrained. You know, we can say we're going to do one thing, but as soon as that door closes,
Right.
are we really doing it?
Do you think that there's something to be said about whether it's the government controlling those prisons or any sort of private organization owning those prisons? Do you think there's any difference between the two with that scenario that you're talking about? If anybody tries to enact any sort of prison reform or anything like that, do you think that the result of such a thing would be any different if corporations were controlling prisons or if government prisons were?
I don't know. I guess I don't know enough on the topic to be completely certain, but it just seems to me, you know, putting a Band-Aid over a mortal wound, you know, we're certainly going to try, we're going to talk about it, it's going to be in the media, but how far does it really get? You know, does it get to the guard on cell block C who's working the prison system and he's already racist? Or, you know, I don't know. It's really hard to tell. I love the idea, but it seems like a very long-term change. And I like what you said, you know, who should be funding it? Who should be in charge of it? I'm sure that grows deep with our American democracy.
Yeah.
When it comes to that talks first. Sorry, we probably didn't answer that very well, but I would like to think ethics would change, but I don't think they will.
Well, still seems no debate with that one. It seems they still both agree on that one.
That's Mila, by the way.
Yeah, this is Mila. She likes licking my hand a lot.
Okay.
What else you got?
How do you think the media influenced the stigma of people of color?
Well, the documentary brought up the Emmett Till situation, where that was one instance where it worked in reverse of what it has throughout history, which is it was just shown plainly for the first time in front of the entire world how poorly people of color were treated in America at that time. And Emmett Till was the one where it was the mother who agreed to give the open casket as opposed to a closed casket after the son, Emmett Till, was beat to death by the police. Or not by the police, I think just someone. Or a group of people.
I think it was
by the river. Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
In the documentary. I hadn't heard of it before, but in the documentary, that's...
But of course, outside of cases like that, especially around that time period in the anywhere from the Gilded Age in the 1910s to all the way up to Martin Luther King in the 1960s, where the majority of the facets of media in our country was rooting very much against people of color and African Americans to try and enforce those Jim Crow laws that were enacted in the 1920s and forward until Martin Luther King. And so, in terms of answering the question, for the most part, especially throughout history, the media stigma has been very negative towards people of color. Until, of course, regular people with iPhones and laptops, etc., have had access to promoting content on social media and can actually get the word out themselves, as opposed to relying on a corporation like the CNN or BBC or Fox or whoever to feed that information to them.
That's a perfect answer. We're not relying on those main news sources anymore as our one take of a scenario and information. I think we now question more things than we ever did in history.
Agreed. Yeah.
You know, you move back to the 70s and 80s when we flipped on the 5 p.m. news. Whatever they said, we bought it. Yeah. We're like, yep, that's what happened. Those are the facts because the box in the room told us that.
Right.
But perfect. And that kind of same with my answer, my first question. You have to be hiding under a rock not to know something today. Mm-hmm. Because we expose everything. People are making up their own minds. And that can be misleading as well. You know, just because you see a video on YouTube or someone's passing it around social media doesn't make the narrative true until
Right.
you have all of the facts. But again, because it's exposed, because it's out there in mass, we're now having these conversations we never had before, like we are right now.
Right. And so, in large, you would agree that the stigma of the media throughout history has been largely negative until recently, where those I guess realizations of us being able to put out our own messages individually as opposed to relying on those corporations.
It's definitely a work in progress. It is changing.
Right.
It is changing. We're making up our own minds based on what we see now, and hopefully it's getting better. I still think it'll take a long time, but I'm also old and cynical.
Yeah. All right. Do you have any thoughts, Jesse?
Next question.
Next question.
How do you think the 13th Amendment can be altered to mitigate the loophole brought up in the documentary?
This one was the simple one that we came up with.
Yeah.
Well, that loophole being, of course, the
Slavery.
the forbidding of slavery within the U.S.
And then,
with exception of those being punished for crime, and that's where the private prison question comes into place. Is where you have all these private prisons that make a profit off of having people in prison, and then of course they contract those prisoners to different companies that would enjoy that free labor, because the Constitution allows for us to contract out that work, that free labor, because it says that we can have them do work for free without being paid, because it's being used as a punishment for a crime that they committed. And then of course that allowed for the excuses throughout especially the 70s and 80s to cause what the documentary called mass incarceration, where laws were just being pretty much made up in order to arrest people. And it can be said, or it can be argued, whether this was purposefully targeted towards black people or any other person of color or not. That's still left up for debate. But what it did evidently do is allow for massive amounts of incarceration to happen, and then therefore lots of free labor to be used, which anyone that disagrees with slavery would agree is wrong, that free labor, no matter what, is a problem.
Yeah, I don't know. I've got a 50-50 on that one. 100% agree with what you said. And I don't like the idea of creating laws and incarcerating people just to make them slaves or, free labor.
Right.
I find that ridiculous. Now, like I said, balance back and forth on that, because, true criminals, put them to work. If you're a true criminal in prison, now for me it's not about color, but, obviously the topic of this conversation is about those that are in color. But if you're in prison, are we supposed to keep you in prison and, here's your TV, here's your gym, have at it? Or can the country make better use of that time that's being spent? I don't know, it's a really tough topic to discuss, I guess, but the idea of incarcerating people for labor, that's ridiculous. I don't like that idea for slavery purposes.
Well, it is a fair point.
Yeah.
That taxpayer money is being used to keep prisoners sheltered and keep them fed and keep them hydrated, etc. But I guess where the debate on that issue really comes down to is what labor is, and if people not only have a right to be forced to do it for free, or to not be forced to do it for free, or if people have a right to be paid for any labor that they do, which I think are two very different concepts. I do think that anyone with a free will and red blood has the right to not be forced to do labor, but I also don't think that everyone with free will has the ingrained right to get paid for any labor that they have chosen to do, which now it's weirdly put where are those prisoners choosing to do that labor because they chose to do the crime that put them in prison, or are they not choosing to because it's being sentenced to them?
Right.
And that, to be perfectly honest, I don't know the answer to that. And I try and stay out of that conversation because I'm not very informed on that sort of stuff. So
Kind of a long-winded answer.
yeah, I'd take too long to answer.
No,
it.
I'm saying for both of us going back and forth. A lot of thoughts going through that.
Yeah.
How did the documentary change your perspective on America in its early stages?
Well, to be perfectly honest, this documentary didn't expose the sorts of things it talked about to me first. I was already aware of a lot of the ideas in it, and so I won't say that the documentary itself changed my perspective on a lot, but upon learning the issues in the documentary that were brought up, before learning about those, I was very typical patriot about the early stages of America. But upon learning all the different things that were spoken about in the documentary, specifically the way media, especially different media moguls like the Yellow Page documentaries and all that during the 20s, and I can't think of any others right now, but a bunch of others, how they would kind of congregate to establish agendas to kind of brainwash the American people. That I'm not a very big fan of. And so my opinion did change. And that's not just with, the issue of segregation in our country. It's with a lot of others as well. And so I don't think that the early stages of America were as hunky-dory as we were taught to believe when we were little.
Agreed. And I don't necessarily think it's all from a dark perspective. I always feel like when we have this conversation, we talk about history and kind of rewriting it and erasing some of it. But what the truth is a lot of it's missing.
True.
We just kind of like that conversation I had earlier, like when I said when I was a kid, if you saw it on TV, you took it as Bond. When you went to school and they read you and taught you and you took tests, they said this is how history was to you.
Right.
We just didn't get the full picture. But, as I mentioned, your generations and the older generations are learning today through documentaries like this and many other things that, history wasn't quite the way we thought it was.
That's right.
And maybe it was, but we just didn't get the whole story. We didn't get y'all's side of the story. We didn't get y'all's side of the story. They told us this story.
Mm-hmm.
And we accepted it, but when you're a kid, you don't know any better. You just accept what you're told.
Right. And, of course, there's something to be said is that there's always been that phrase, history is told by the victors of whatever situation
Exactly.
it is you're discussing. And so America is such a new country that we're still the victors in any situation that we talk about. And so it's hard to kind of find out what really happened and dig deeper until we give ourselves the time and ability to discuss what actually happened. And I think that's happening right now as we speak with all these new conversations coming up about America's history. And yeah, that's what I think.
Is that good? we did good on that question.
Yes. I don't have any more questions left for y'all, but if y'all have any questions, I can try to answer.
So what did the documentary, did it change your perspective on things? You're fairly young yet, so I don't, obviously I don't know what they teach in class anymore. You school 20 years before you did. So 30, I don't know how many 100 years it was. But
from the documentary, I don't feel that I learned about any new issues that were going on during the earlier stages of America. I was just kind of informed on the kind of severity of it, honestly, with the examples like the what was it, Emmett Till and Travis. I don't remember the last name.
They know. They watched the video.
I don't remember the name. But those examples were just some things that really just showed me how severe it really was, with the little information I knew before watching the documentary.
Let me ask
Fair
you this:
enough.
being an older person, now we're having this discussion based on this documentary. How do you feel? Does it make you angry to think that because you were told, kind of this is the story, history, this is what happened? Does it anger you as young people to feel like that people were trying to pull the shades over your eyes, so to speak, or do you see it more as a open book, like, okay, this isn't really just the history that happened because we're learning this took place, we're learning this took place. Are you more open-minded about it? Because some people get mad about it.
Right.
Particularly those are the victims of the stories that
Yeah.
weren't told.
Yeah.
I'm kind of open-minded about it because I think we did. I mean, I remember learning a lot about racial inequality and segregation in school, and I think, I mean, that's where I learned mostly about this stuff. I didn't really see anything besides that.
Fair enough.
I mean, I grew up in a predominantly white town. It was strange to see people of color, but I loved it. I mean, my family embraced that kind of thing. Now, I'm sure not everybody did where I'm from, but you know, that's got to be different growing up here. I mean, you grew up with people of color from the day you're born
Yeah.
in a metropolitan area.
Mm-hmm.
So my perspective was very small until I got into my older years and started expanding, you know, going to college
Mm-hmm.
and seeing like, oh, I got 5 black people in my class this year. You know, that just didn't happen growing up for me.
Yeah.
So you just kind of had, you know, it wasn't it's not like we were racist and, you know, we'd kept people out. You just had one perspective based on your culture. I saw it
Right.
as a cultural thing, not a
Yeah.
color thing. But you guys, you're involved in so much different culture at your schools. It's got to be a different experience growing up, and probably a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's all I have.
That's all I have.
How about you,
Any more
Sean?
questions?
Pretty close. No, I don't have any more questions. I mean, this is great stuff to talk about.
Agreed.
I mean, it's nice to have, a forum like this where it's not negative, where they're showing you something and we're sitting down and having a conversation, assignment or not. We're
True.
still
Yeah.
having the conversation.
Yeah. It's not like a hostile environment when you're talking about this stuff right here. Yeah, I think this was great. I think this was a good time.
Well, thank y'all for joining me in our discussion, debate, whatever you want to call it. But
Yes, it was a heated debate.
Sean Lee, signing off.
Grayson Huff.
Jesse Huff, thank you.